Hello, I'm Dr. Emma Parker and I'm Associate Professor of English in the School of Arts at the University of Leicester. I teach 20th century and contemporary literature and I have a specialism in women's writing. I've published on authors such as Margaret Atwood, Toni Morrison, Angela Carter, Jeanette Winterson, Kate Atkinson and Sarah Waters, and I co-edited this book, The History of British Women's Writing, 1970 to Present. My research shapes my teaching, and one of my favourite modules is called Feminist Fiction. This module examines the influence of feminism on fiction and the ways that fiction responds to feminist issues and debates. Students who take the module follow the evolution of feminist fiction in conjunction with the development of Anglo-American feminist thought. From Sylvia Plath's proto-feminist novel The Bell Jar, published in the early 1960s, through second-wave feminism in the 1970s and 80s, to third-wave and post-feminism in the 90s, represented by Helen Fielding's Bridget Jones's Diary. We consider the ways in which novels respond to feminist concerns in different social and historical contexts, and we examine the intersection of gender and race in Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, gender and class in Pat Barker's Union Street, and gender and sexuality in Jeanette Winterson's Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. But what is feminist fiction? There's no single fixed definition of the term. Feminist fiction has always been varied and multifaceted. Nonetheless, there are some unifying features that make it recognisably feminist fiction. In order to identify a body of literature as feminist fiction, we might consider the following questions. Who writes it? Who publishes it? What's it about? And who reads it? One definition of feminist fiction is fiction inspired by the women's liberation movement, an organisation that protested sexism and campaigned for gender equality. Following the emergence of the women's movement in the 1960s, literature played a major role in the dissemination of the aims and ideals of second-wave feminism. Several well-known authors were active members of the women's liberation movement, and their fiction directly engages with feminist issues of the day. But throughout the 70s and 80s, many novelists not directly involved in the women's movement published novels that were still influenced by it. These writers were, and are, many are still active, self-declared feminists. Jeanette Winterson, in particular, is vocal about her commitment to feminism in essays and journalism. And in 2018 she published a book about the ongoing struggle for gender equality. Courage Calls to Courage Everywhere. The book's title echoes the rallying call to action issued by Millicent Fawcett, President of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, who in 2018 became the first woman to be commemorated with a statue in Parliament Square. The colours of Winterson's book cover, purple, white and green, are those of the Women's Social and Political Union. Thus, by invoking two organisations that campaigned for women's suffrage at the beginning of the 20th century, Winterson aligns herself with a history of feminist activism and implicitly declares feminism an unfinished revolution. So a writer like Jeanette Winterson illustrates that feminist fiction is, as the critic Anne Cranny Francis states, fiction written from a self-consciously feminist perspective, consciously encoding an ideology which is in direct opposition to the dominant gender ideology of Western society, that is, patriarchal ideology. However, not all feminist fiction is produced by women who align themselves with the women's movement or identify as feminists. Doris Lessing, for example, persistently distanced herself from feminism across her career. Lessing never described herself as a feminist. In fact, she said, "I wasn't an active feminist in the 60s, never have been." And she's been critical of the impact of feminism on women, saying, I don't think that the feminist movement has done much for the character of women. Nevertheless, Lessing's novel The Golden Notebook is widely regarded as a feminist classic. Like Doris Lessing, Sylvia Plath became a novelist before the advent of the women's liberation movement in the late 1960s. Her novel The Bell Jar articulates the same concerns about the status of women expressed in early articulations of second-wave feminist thought, but the two emerge in tandem, so it's not really possible to claim that Plath is directly influenced by feminism or was herself a feminist. For this reason, The Bell Jar is best described as proto-feminist fiction. So, feminist fiction is written by feminists, but it's possible for women who don't identify as feminists to produce feminist fiction too. A second definition of feminist fiction is fiction published by a feminist publisher. Feminist publishing houses founded in the 70s and early 80s, such as Virago, The Women's Press, Pandora, Only Women and Sheba, carved out space for women writers in an overwhelmingly male literary field. Pat Barker published her first novel, Union Street, with Virago, and Jeanette Winterson's first novel, Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, was published by Pandora. So both writers signal their feminism by publishing with a feminist publisher. Few of these feminist publishing houses still exist today, reflecting the transition of feminist fiction from the margins to the mainstream of culture. Virago is still going, but it's now owned by Little Brown. Honno, the Welsh Women's Press, is still in operation, but that's a rare exception. So not all feminist fiction is published by a feminist publisher, especially since the 1980s. A more effective way to identify feminist fiction than through the author's self-professed political position or her publisher is through the central themes and concerns of the novel. Feminist fiction explores feminist issues, principally women's identity and experience, patriarchal oppression, and the quest for female freedom and empowerment. This results in a focus on themes such as marriage and motherhood, sexual violence, sisterhood, and the body. In her essay on Women and Writing, A Room of One's Own, published at the beginning of the 20th century, Virginia Woolf asserted that she sought in her novels to tell the truth about my own experiences as a body. And this is an aim still pursued by women writers almost a century on. So feminist fiction is defined then by its preoccupation with women and female experience. However, feminist fiction can pose as much of a challenge to prevailing feminist thought as it does to patriarchy. In its focus on a privileged middle-class heterosexual white female, a novel like Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar epitomises the limitations or blind spots of liberal feminism as it emerged in the 1960s. Toni Morrison's novel The Bluest Eye challenges the whiteness of second-wave feminism. Pat Barker's representation of a community of northern working class women in Union Street challenges the individualism of bourgeois liberal feminism. Through its focus on a female protagonist who falls in love with another girl, Jeanette Winterson's Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit challenges the heteronormativity of second-wave feminism. As these novels indicate, there's an increasing awareness of the importance of diversity and inclusivity in feminist fiction across the second half of the 20th century. Helen Fielding's Bridget Jones's Diary is set against the backdrop of post-feminism and third-wave feminism, which sought to reclaim aspects of femininity and female experience repudiated by the second wave as disempowering. In her individualism, consumerism and self-objectification, Bridget is a poster girl for third-wave feminism. But as Fielding's intertextual allusions to Jane Austen indicate, The novel is a satire that questions Bridget's faux feminism, a free market neoliberal feminism that supports the advance of individual women whilst leaving patriarchal structures in place. So, as the critic Mary Eagleton notes, a feminist novel is a novel produced within an awareness of contemporary feminist concerns, but by no means one that promotes any party line. The feminism of feminist fiction is often reflected as much in its form as its themes, through genre, narration and structure, for example. Feminist fiction blends sexual and textual politics. It integrates politics and aesthetics. In the 1970s, feminist fiction tended towards domestic realism, a genre well suited to telling the truth about women's lives. However, while realism purports to offer an accurate reflection of reality, feminism calls concepts such as truth and objectivity into question, and feminist fiction that employs realism often subverts its conventions. For example, Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar defies the linearity associated with realism by jumping backwards and forwards in time. And Pat Barker's Union Street features a group of women rather than focusing on a single protagonist. This subversion of literary convention reflects feminist fiction's oppositional stance and expresses its desire for change. The importance of change is flagged in the title of Gail Green's book about feminist fiction, Changing the Story. Feminist fiction rewrites the conventional script of women's lives and uses form to reflect theme. New stories are told in new ways. Thus, feminist fiction blends politics with aesthetics to put art in the service of activism. In terms of genre, feminist fiction often takes the form of a Bildungsroman, the novel of development, a genre that lends itself well to the representation of women's journey towards self-realisation. Traditionally, the Bildungsroman follows the growth of a male protagonist and his progress from social alienation to integration. Here are a few well-known examples. In contrast to these novels, the feminist Bildungsroman typically signals the psychological growth of a heroine through her refusal of social conformity. And this is underlined by the novel's conclusion. Feminist fiction typically rejects the conventional ending for female characters in literature: marriage for good women and death for bad ones. This makes the conclusion of feminist fiction quietly optimistic. Feminist fiction insists on the possibility and necessity of social transformation, and it presents women as agents of change and arbiters of hopeful futurity. As well as favouring the Bildungsroman, feminist fiction often employs marginalised or popular literary genres. Jeanette Winterson's Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, for example, makes use of fantasy, fairy tales and romance. The lower literary status of such genres reflects and bespeaks the social marginalisation experienced by women in a patriarchal world. At the same time, Winterson's use of such genres also epitomises a strategy that is widespread in feminist fiction: revision. She explains, "My work is full of cover versions. I like to take stories we think we know and record them differently." Angela Carter, perhaps known to some of you through her collection of feminist fairy tales, The Bloody Chamber, an A-level set text, also championed revision as a subversive literary technique. Carter explained, "I'm all for putting new wine in old bottles, especially if the pressure of the new wine makes the old bottles explode." Carter's metaphor of exploding bottles captures the incendiary character of much feminist fiction, which typically features wild girls and woman warriors who refuse to be living dolls. These strong, feisty, rebel women function as role models for others, inspiring resistance or revolution more widely. And what about men as readers of and characters in feminist fiction? Feminist fiction is typically considered to be written by, about and for women. However, this doesn't mean that it's not open to male readers. The prevailing assumption that literature about men has universal significance and appeal, but literature about women is narrow or specialist, leads many men to dismiss feminist fiction. This is a pity, as feminist fiction has a lot to say to men. While feminist fiction is unapologetically woman-centred, it is attentive to men and masculinity. It espouses a consciousness that if masculinity and femininity are defined in opposition to each other, we can understand neither without considering both. So much feminist fiction critiques dominant definitions of manhood and presents hegemonic masculinity as harmful to men and women alike. Ultimately then, feminist fiction shows that the reconfiguration of gender norms is liberating for everyone. This introduction to feminist fiction has raised questions that I've deliberately left unanswered. Questions such as, is feminist fiction a useful label? Can men write feminist fiction? And if feminist fiction has moved from the margins to the mainstream, does a module like feminist fiction return it to a literary ghetto? If you're interested in debating issues like this, if you're interested in further questions about the relationship between literature and gender or women's writing, you might like to apply to read English at the University of Leicester. It would be great to have you on the course and great to have you on my module, Feminist Fiction. If you have any questions about English at Leicester, please get in touch. I'm Emma Parker and my email address is ep27@leicester.ac.uk. Thank you.